Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Dangerous Rhetoric. This is episode 118. I'm Brentley. My co-host Daniel is not available today. He'll be back whenever he has availability. Today, I have for you author Phil Illy. Phil has wrote the book on auto-heterosexuality called Auto-Heterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex. You guys can find that on Amazon. Phil is also on Substack, right, Phil? You got phililly.substack.com.
Yep, and on Twitter at autogynephilic.
Yes. So, Phil, thank you for taking the time coming on the show. Appreciate it. There's some controversy. We'll get into it later. But I wanted to just briefly, if you could just sort of like sum up your backstory. Like, how did you get to become like Phil Illy writing about autosexuality?
Well, like 4 or 5 years ago, I encountered the concept of autogynephilia and sort of inferred that I should look into this to see if I had this thing, because I learned about the two-type typology in which, there's a type of transsexualism that's caused by homosexuality, and then there's another one caused by autogynephilia. And I knew that my wish to be female was related to my attraction to women, So I deduced that I wasn't the homosexual type. And so, I just started reading about autogynephilia, and I looked at all the interviews I could with the main scientists that talked about it. I read the studies. I went all the way back to the start of the sexology literature and read from the beginning to the present. I was being told by trans women online that this wasn't real, and it kind of made me doubt my reality because the science seemed really strong. And so that made me dive really deep into reading the literature. And then it got to a point where I learned too much to not turn it into something that could benefit other people. And so I started writing a book so that my kind could learn about their orientation in a way that was, kind of neutral, not judgmental in any way, just so that they could figure out like, hey, what's going on with me?
Word. So that led you to write the book. How long did that take you? When did you start writing, and when did you publish it?
Well, I just obsessively read papers for like a year before even thinking of doing a book. And then I started the process of writing the book in June of 2020. And I finished the manuscript about a year ago at this point. So it took about, 2.5, 3 years to finish the book.
That's it's a good amount of time.
Yeah, I think it's a really quick turnaround time considering how long it is and how in depth it is.
Yeah, I was looking at it. It's like 700 pages, right? And you go really in depth. Like I was looking through it and saw that there's like, you give a lot of definitions, a lot of terminology, and it would look like you were sort of trying to do this exhaustive description almost of the phenomenon and connect it to the transgender issue and show how basically like a lot of these people who believe themselves to be transgender might actually be more heterophilic.
Well, yeah, it's not that people are not actually transgender. It's just that this is the explanation for why they are transgender.
Okay. Well, see, that's one of those points where you and I probably disagree, because I don't really think anybody's transgender. I don't think there's, people are born in the wrong body. Really, I mean, what I think sort of is that we're seeing the manifestation of complex trauma. We've had probably 4 D-trans people on the show, including Laura Becker, who, and 2 trans people who stayed trans after, their transition. That was Mr. I'm blanking right now. Buck Angel and who's the other one? Miss Sarah Higdon. Those are the 2 trans people who actually speak positively of their transition and don't regret it. But everybody, all six of the people we've had on, have reported trauma in their backstory. So I sort of came to the conclusion that there's definitely a trauma aspect here with gender confusion, and it seems to also be occurring in a lot of these kids that crop up online. Chloe Cole's reported background of trauma, so it's I don't know your experience, if you have an experience of trauma or not. If you want to elaborate on that, you're more than welcome to, or not. I don't like to prod there because it's obviously very personal.
I don't really. I've seen a lot of people propose the trauma hypothesis for gender issues and for autogynephilia, and I'm overall doubtful of the trauma hypothesis because it seems pretty unfalsifiable. When people say trauma, it's like, what specifically are you talking about? And it's usually just like an experience that was too intense for them to incorporate at the time, and it left a mark, basically.
No, that's the definition of trauma, really.
Right. But it's sort of such a broad, nebulous thing. And I just don't think trauma is like where serious gender issues ultimately arise. Because and the reason I think that is because Blanchard's research that he conducted throughout the 80s, he found that virtually all male to female transsexuals had one of two anomalous sexual orientations. They were either homosexual or they were autogynephilic. And since sexual orientations are sort of like predispositions that are largely inborn, like sure, our early life maybe can impact like the sort of women or men we're attracted to, but I don't think it'll ultimately impact, at least for males, too much of how their orientation ultimately develops. I think it's pre-existing and latent before it's revealed later in life what they're attracted to. And so, I just think there's, at least for male to female transsexualism, there's pretty solid evidence that it's a byproduct of atypical gender-based sexual orientations.
Yeah, so that's also where I've gotten in trouble before. I talk about the causes of homosexuality, and a lot of people don't like to talk about that because as soon as you start talking about the causes of homosexuality, people tend to view it as a defect. It's a deviance from the norm. By definition, it is deviant. We're only a couple percentage out of the total population, but it's you can see how that kind of like triggers people a little bit. They get a little sensitive when you talk about like the causes of something. But that's one of the things that I thought that trauma also can be associated with male homosexuality. I have a lot of the guys that I've spoken with just over, I'm 41 years old. I've probably had several hundred sexual partners and, thousands of gay friends or gay acquaintances over the years, at least. And usually when the subject comes up, there's a trauma component. They were either abused as a child, or it was more of a neglect kind of situation where the child wasn't really given a lot of attention from 0 to 5, 6, 7, 8 from their male parent, or the male parent wasn't in the picture at all. And that's just a pattern that I noticed. It's my subjective experience coming up. And so, of course, naturally, I elaborate that into a more generalized thing. But, as to whether or not that's the actual cause of homosexuality or not, who knows? It's just something I enjoy thinking about and discussing and bouncing around with other people.
How do you feel about Blanchard's hypothesis of have you heard about like the fraternal birth order effect?
No, that's the thing that says what, like the later you come, the more likely you are to be gay?
Right. Basically, the more older brothers you have born to the same mother, the more likely you are to be gay.
Yeah, I've heard about that, but I'm sort of evidence of the opposite. I'm the firstborn, and I'm the only homosexual in my family of 4 kids. So I'm the eldest of 4.
Right, and that's just one of the causes of homosexuality, though. And
I definitely think there's probably multiple causes. And what seems to be the case is that it happens more frequently in population dense areas. So like things where there's more, where you have like a bigger family. They could maybe explain it from an evolutionary biology point of view, because homosexuals in a community are very evolutionarily expensive, right? We don't sort of like contribute to the gene pool directly.
Right.
Generally
speaking. Yeah, it's sort of like, how does that even happen evolutionarily? You would think it wouldn't even happen.
Right. So there has to be some reason for it, because it happens. You know, like that's kind of the whole evolutionary sauce. But that's kind of, I think that there's probably some cases like that. I've also seen, I've known twins that were both homosexual. So there's definitely a genetic component. My personal beliefs at this point is that there's a genetic and an environmental component. And sometimes you get both and sometimes you don't. I think that there can be a situation probably for a lot of like different gender confusion issues and sexual stuff that comes up, where it's an environmental and a genetic propensity. So if you have the genetic switch, it doesn't really activate unless you get that sort of environmental cue at some point in your development. But yeah, I was curious. You talk about auto heterosexuality as an orientation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that sexual orientation is a broader thing than whether you're sexually attracted to just men, women, or neither.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think the construct of sexual orientation has multiple dimensions to it beyond just gender. There's also, age, for instance, where it's like men often have this preference for younger partners. Or, people just they have some age preferences. It tends to be like young adult is often like people's peak attractiveness in terms of what they like.
Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of evolutionary biology, right? So women tend to prefer older men because they are better providers, whereas men prefer younger women because they're more reproductively able.
Right. That's like the evo-psych explanation for that. Yeah. But basically, like, regardless of where that preference comes from, age is one of the dimensions of sexual preference. And there's also location, which is the thing that I'm more knowledgeable in, about whether your orientation is directed externally outside of yourself or internally towards yourself. And when it's directed internally, it creates autosexuality and makes you want to become whatever it is that you love.
Mm-hmm. So would you think the same? Would you think that it impacts like bodybuilders, for example? Like, I'm curious if you think it's a similar phenomenon between like dudes that like sort of obsessively work out to become like bigger, more like, this sort of masculine, muscular ideal. Is that sort of like a similar phenomenon in like the like same sex direction, or do you think that's something else altogether?
I would say if they're homosexual men, that there's a decent chance of that, because that their sexual object preference would be men,
Mm-hmm.
Muscly men, perhaps. And then if that gets directed inward, it could make them want to be it. Like there's at least one case study of male autoandrophilia in the literature, and I've talked to a couple online through like DMs. Male autoandrophilia does seem to be a thing in a subset of homosexuals.
There's also a famous Japanese guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head now. But he was like known for sort of he didn't really identify as a homosexual, but he sort of was in love with this like idea of a masculinized ideal man, and the pursuit of that ideal. And then I can't remember what the heck his name
Was he the one that was into being like stabbed? Like, it was kind of gory what he was into, and then he like launched this rebellion and died by being like, in combat.
I think that sounds very familiar. I'm trying to remember his name. ChatGPT didn't help. I didn't give it a very good prompt though.
Yeah,
but
the Oracle didn't know.
Yeah, well, I did give it a crappy prompt. But yeah, that's definitely that sounds like familiar, like part of a story. but that struck me as very similar, except it's a man instead of who seeing himself as a woman being the ideal, seeing himself as this sort of masculized, uh, this ideal man would be the sort of like driving force behind it. And he was also a homosexual, though he didn't like that terminology, if I recall correctly.
Right, but it still shows the basic principle that sometimes sexual orientation gets routed inward and makes you want to become whatever it is you find attractive.
Right. Yeah. So for me, I guess sexual orientation, I think, attraction to men or attraction to women. And that's sort of where I've delimited the concept. Whereas you've included attraction to self versus attraction to other. Um,
Yeah, and there's also, like I said, age is one of the dimensions, and I think what's important to bring up when talking about whether these things count as sexual orientation is that I'm talking about it from a psychology framework. I'm not talking about it in terms of what should count as sexual orientation according to social norms or according to legal frameworks. I'm talking just specifically human psychology, how it seems to work.
Sure. No, that's understandable. You bring up age, like that's an interesting point because a lot of people, are the James Cantors of the world, are trying to make pedophilia more of a sexual orientation, as opposed to like a predatory practice or something. That is a major concern from a lot of people across the, especially conservatives. Conservatives are hot against that one.
Yeah, I think when this conversation comes up, it's important to demarcate between an attraction to children and acting on that attraction. When people use the term pedophilia, they often think that means acting on it, and that is obviously morally wrong. So I just think it's important to have that distinction where like someone can be like have that lifelong attraction to kids, and as long as they don't act on it, it's hard to say like morally what was wrong.
Right, because you're basically accusing them of a thought crime, which we don't do. Well,
Yeah,
theory.
Yeah, and I understand being wary of people that have pedophilia. Like obviously, it causes a ton of harm, and there's a reason that people get so up in arms about it.
Oh, wait, there's a lot of kids out there that have grown up to be adults who never had any sort of justice. It's kind of it's like an elephant in the room, really. That along with the sort of child trafficking epidemic that's happening, that's being facilitated actively by the U.S. government and actors like Jeffrey Epstein. So this is all like in the backdrop of this conversation, which makes it even more landmine filled and tenuous. But you delineate between pedophiles who act on it and pedophiles who don't. Whereas in my mind, if you're basically declaring yourself to be a pedophile, you've acted on it. You know what I mean? So like you've either viewed images of, in my mind, I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you're willing to go that far, the odds that they've acted on it are high. Also, we have to remember that pedophiles are, child predators. I don't even like the word pedophile because pedophile is sort of a translation of like, child, like lover of children, whereas in my mind, it would be some like, a childless adult that actually enjoys facilitating the development of kids as opposed to preying upon them sexually. But, like I prefer the term like child predator. And we know that child predators generally have hundreds of victims per individual before they're ever caught. And some of them are never caught. So that's more, I guess I'm more focused on the victim side of things than I am the pedophile. Like James Cantor also likes to do this thing where he separates, offender versus, seeking treatment individual. And while, yeah, it's great that people are seeking treatment, frankly, I don't trust anybody that's sort of publicizing themselves as a pedophile in treatment. To me, I see that as more of a grooming of society to be accepting of pedophiles the same way that we've accepted homosexuals and now transgender individuals into society.
Well, so I think it's important to like I feel like this pedophilia is like obviously different from transgenderism or homosexuality in that acting on it is pretty much always immoral in terms of like, looking at the like, what's that acronym? Child sex abuse material, looking at like, yeah, CSAM, or, actually acting on it with a real kid, that's obviously morally reprehensible, right? Whereas on the other hand, like the gender-based stuff, like homosexuality, can be acted on ethically, and sometimes it's acted on unethically too. Like there's obviously rape among homosexuals too.
Oh yeah. U.S. prisons are rife with it, and we sort of have this running joke about it, but nobody seems to really want to address like the problem. Like we consider it a problem, but like, there's this sort of like taciturn or latent idea that they sort of deserve it, which is it's always been a little fucked up to me, but.
Yeah, no. And so, yeah, I guess I was just trying to point out that the gender-based attractions are not as ethically or morally fraught. I think with part of what I think will be good about increasing public awareness of autoheterosexuality, female autoandrophilia, male autogynephilia, is that people will finally be able to have a real discussion around like just using constructs that accurately reflect reality. And I expect the liberal discourse process to be ugly, but ultimately that it'll arrive at some sort of steady state solution that accommodates most people well enough.
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of the beauty of Western society, right? We can have these difficult, tense, fraught discussions and not murder each other like some people in other parts of the world. But I find this whole subject like really fascinating. Another thing that I saw in your book, you sort of shy away from the idea of kink and fetishism. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't use those terms to talk about autogynephilia and autoandrophilia because they tend to stop people from thinking clearly. They're terms where if you describe something as a kink or a fetish,
they're triggering, you might say.
It's more that it gets like devalued as unimportant or something that's just strictly erotic, or it places various restrictions and negative sentiments on something that, as far as I can tell, arguably counts as a sexual orientation. And so I just use the term sexual orientation because if someone has a stable sexual preference for a particular type of thing, I think that counts as their sexual orientation.
Okay, but so let me just let me hit you with some terminology and see what you think. So to me, a kink is what I would describe as an atypical sexual practice. So generally, that it's an activity that we would get into that would eventually culminate in orgasm that most of the population doesn't get into, right? So I don't know if that so AGPism seems to be also like a lifestyle in addition to sort of an erotic thing for some people. Now I don't know what the proportion is of AGPs who perhaps don't don't complete their don't orgasm to the idea of themselves as a woman. Versus people who that just dress up as the woman and like to see themselves and maybe get positive gender feelings or gender associated positivity from seeing themselves as a woman, but don't necessarily feel the need to masturbate to themselves in that dress. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit.
I think both of those count as autogynephilia. Like it often autogynephiles, they'll sort of operate under their female persona in a way that it's acceptable to their self-image. So like you described, they might just dress up and like to see themselves that way and not do anything sexual related to it. And it'll feel better for them to not be like, it'll feel classier to them to not be doing sexual things. And so it's more egocentric than if they were to have like overt eroticism associated with that behavior.
Right. Okay. So it's so in like the way that I define it, it could be considered a kink if you take it into the bedroom, so to speak.
I mean, You could call it a kink if you want. I just think it has such a huge impact on how people think. It goes really deep in their psychology. It changes how they think about gender and their place in the world of gender. It changes how they think they want to live their lives, and they construct their lives in such a way to accommodate it, sort of like how they would with heterosexuality or homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I tend to just call it an orientation.
I feel you. No, I'm coming from like the gay, my experience in the gay community, specifically with like the BDSM crowd, and how they would, often refer to it as sort of like a lifestyle in addition to like a kinky sexual practice. Now, a fetish is a little bit different. A kink is like an atypical sexual practice. A fetish is more like a requirement. At least that's how like these are the way the words get used most often, in terms of the definitions. So like you really can't have arousal or achieve orgasm without the particular whatever it is in place. For
Right.
the BDSM people, they need to be getting hit or being hit in order to achieve orgasm. Whereas I suppose if you had to, the only way that you could achieve orgasm would be, viewing yourself as a woman, then you would call it a fetishistic practice, or at that point it would be considered a fetish.
So the way fetish gets used, the way sexologists use it is sexual fetishism is an attraction to non-living objects or non-genital body parts. And so it's quite different from the colloquial usage of fetish or the version you just mentioned. What you mentioned in terms of it being an obligatory sort of stimuli to facilitate arousal, like that would qualify as a paraphilia in the sense, versus a paraphilic interest, which is like, say you like doing those things that are atypical, but you don't need it to get off. You could consider them paraphilic interests. But then if they're obligatory, then you could consider a paraphilia.
Okay.
Because it's like, yeah, and para just means like beyond. It's just like, it just means any atypical sexuality. And the term paraphilia is just defined in relation to what is called normophilia in the DSM, which is just, when you see a physically normal adult and you want to get closer to them and rub up on them and have sex with them. Like, basically what we think of as vanilla. So basically, that's why in my book, I call all the things paraphilic. I just call them non-vanilla because it sort of, it demarcates in a very similar way, but in language that is, I think a little more understandable to people. And it's just pointing out that it's atypical, but it's not making a value judgment.
Mm-hmm. I feel you. Makes sense for sure. So another thing with auto-heterosexuality is that it's got this like different degrees, right? So you mentioned that sometimes like guys could wear like ladies' underwear under their sort of like standard dress. And that could be like enough, versus people who have to like, really fully dress down in female garb in order to, really see themselves as a woman. And without that, you guys experience like depression-like symptoms. Am I getting that correctly?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it's sort of like how with people have conventional sexual orientations where if they're being frustrated in their sex life, like they're not able to find partners that are compatible with them, that they'll sort of feel pretty crappy about it and be kind of depressed.
Yeah, I can report experiencing that in the past.
Yeah, it's the same sort of feelings, but it's just for like how your state of gender embodiment.
Okay, word. That makes sense. And when we're talking about like the next generation kids coming up, so I know the really popular hypothesis is this sort of like rapid onset gender dysphoria. So that's the idea that, especially among like girls and especially among people that are on the autistic spectrum, that they're very impressionable. And so as soon as like one girl starts identifying as trans, there's like, a dozen trans girls now in her class. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, do you think that's, are we seeing, an expression of autoheterosexuality here, or is this just sort of like, the standard sort of kids going through fads, doing things that are, socially popular in order to fit in?
I do think there's obviously an element of social contagion in the sense that the current media environment and the way transgenderism is talked about in schools, it makes it seem almost like a good thing, like you're better because the reverse oppression, the progressive stack thing,
Especially for young white boys.
right? Yeah, no, and like that can definitely contribute to their gender issues and increase the chance of them just identifying as trans or non-binary. But I do think that there's a lot of these kids that are identifying as trans that have some degree of autoheterosexuality, and it's just that clinicians aren't asking about it, like they don't know to look for it. Even with the males, where it's like it's very established that the most common cause of gender transition in males is autogynephilia, and yet a lot of clinicians have never heard of it, or they don't use it in their thinking. They don't even know there's two different types of trans, so they have some patient come to them and they just have no conceptual framework for understanding what they're looking at.
Yeah, that could be a big problem, right? Especially if they are facilitating like medical transitioning for kids who might not need it, right? That could be
Yeah, no, and that's one of my concerns is that there's clinicians that are helping transition these kids thinking that like, oh, we have to save the trans kids. They have this idea of the trans kid. Instead, I think they should be looking at like, I have this kid that is reporting gender dysphoria. Let's figure out which kind of gender dysphoria they have, because there are discrete types, and then work from there.
right. Yeah, so that's probably where you and I would disagree, is because I would just say that they have a mental health problem that needs treatment, probably stemming from some sort of trauma or some sort of unmet need in childhood, and that's kind of what messed them up. Whereas it's where you would suggest that this is just sort of like the way they are. Is that
yeah, that they have some basically inborn predisposition that makes them more susceptible to developing gender issues, gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it. The denial of their birth sex and the desire to be the other sex. It's autogynephiles are the most common type of male to female transitioner, and I think there's a lot of female to male transitioners that have some degree of autoandrophilia too. Because like I've been observing them online, like throughout the research process for my book, and even now, I follow a bunch of different trans subreddits and other types of subreddits related to this stuff. And,
oof, that must be painful.
no, I'm just observing. I'm what like a rationalist might call a high decoupler, where I can like separate a fact from its like moral consequences. I'm just observing and trying to figure out what's real. And I've noticed in the female to male subreddits, especially like in the say like the gay trans guys subreddit, where it'll be specifically just androphilic trans men, that their overall style of thinking is as if there was a female version, a female counterpart of male autogynephilia, but it's like it's more femme-brained in a way. Like it's more sentimental and feely and less overtly erotic, although some of them definitely do report eroticism relating to it. And when they do have threads like that, a lot of the responses are like, like, wow, I'm glad it's not just me, and things like that. So, and there's also a lot of trans men that specifically like, yaoi or man love man, like boy love sort of genre of erotica. And in those subcultures, there's a high proportion of them that do transition. So it seems to me that there is autoandrophilia influencing female to male transition. And I think once scientists start investigating this possibility, we'll find out the exact proportion that are related to autoandrophilia. We'll find out the proportion that's related to homosexual gender dysphoria, and then we'll figure out, you know, in the remainder, like how many of these are just like social contagion or some other thing.
Yeah, because that's kind of what the one of the things Dr. Kenneth Zucker found. He was this Canadian gender dysphoria specialist in like the 80s and early 90s. And
It still is.
right, yeah, well, yeah. They ousted him from his position at the head of a gender clinic outside of Toronto, I believe, somewhere in Canada.
Yes,
But
at KMH. Yeah.
they came after him because he was an advocate of the watchful waiting, was the rationale it was called, before we had gender affirming. And watchful waiting is this idea where you just sort of like, okay, this kid has like gender dysphoria or, you know, gender confusion, whatever you want to call it. Let's just wait and see what happens. Let's give him, you know, a couple of years, let him develop. And in about like 80% of the cases, roughly, you know, that with his patients, and so these are kids that had it bad enough to go to the doctor over it. It resolved on their own, and you know, a high percentage of those people ended up being adult homosexual.
Yeah. And that's the homosexual type of gender dysphoria. And you know, like I said, there's the two types, and generally the homosexual type is the early onset type. It's the classic image of transsexualism, where it's someone that's just very gender nonconforming from a young age.
The little kid getting into his mom's heels and stuff.
Yeah, and
dancing and all that kind of things.
And a lot of times they'll have gender issues, but then like you said, they'll grow out of it if they're not encouraged to do that stuff. And it seems to be sort of a temporary phase in the development of homosexuals that for some of them they can have gender issues, but then a lot of times once they hit puberty and they just get their first like girlfriend or boyfriend, they realize like, oh, I'm just gay, and then they make peace with their gender variant nature that they don't fit in terms of their, you know, gender nonconformity. And something I want to mention about the Zucker thing is that it's activists got mad at him not just because he was doing watchful waiting, but specifically the institution he was working at as part of I'm forgetting the name. It's abbreviated CAMH, but basically that same facility a few decades ago is where Blanchard did his typology studies. And so like activists have had a vendetta against that hospital for decades now. And so they basically they want to reduce the influence of the Toronto researchers because they don't like what they say, because it goes against what the trans movement wants to think.
It goes against the dogma of the day, right? The dogma du jour.
Yeah, and like my principal interest in countering the dogma is like, because I think it does a disservice to my kind to be told that if you're feeling sad about being your birth sex or that you wish you were the other one, like I think it's a disservice to tell them that means you literally are the other gender, and that means you're trans and you have to transition or you'll be suicidal. I think it artificially forces people into a path that isn't right for a lot of them. And I'm hoping that if more people understand autoheterosexuality, they'll realize, oh, this is where my gender issues are coming from. Let me figure out some ways of like working this into my life that maybe aren't the medical pathway. You know, let me see if there's some other ways I can deal with this based on my circumstances. And I'm hoping that if they understand it better, they'll be able to sort of figure out for themselves, because right now the institutions are failing them.
Yeah, and I mean, the institutions are failing all of us across the board, right? You know, from the federal government and all of its many departments to the media to medical apparatus. You know, I mean, from the handling of the last pandemic to now, you know, mutilating kids is how I think of it. You know, frankly, the use of puberty blockers, for example, is very excited among these trans rights activists and the gender ideologues. They have this idea that if you just get the trans kid, the true trans kid, early enough, and you give them the puberty blockers and you give them the cross-sex hormones, then they'll be happy and they'll be able to go on with life. Sort of not really realizing that the whole thing, you know, medicalized transition in general across the board sort of violates the most basic rules of medicine, from do no harm. I mean, you're doing harm. You're from sterilizing the kids to cutting off healthy body parts. That's harm. To the rationale that, like, otherwise they're going to end themselves. It's just not, it's not borne out in the data. Yeah, especially when you look at people who are post-transition. The data shows, like, post-transition suicidality hits its max at 7 years. So they use all these short-term studies where, it says the kids are very happy, post-transition, without, and then they lose track of people too. So it's very, very shady the way that they would manipulate this data in order to create the perception that these kids that transition young. Meanwhile, we have examples, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was put on puberty blockers. He had the childhood transition. He was a New York resident, and he killed his father and stabbed his sister. And this was, like, I want to say 2-3 years ago. That was a big story at the time. It appeared in the media and it went away because the media doesn't like to talk about how medicalized transition can increase instability in these vulnerable individuals, like in that case, or in the case of, say, Audrey Hale, who we just saw. She just had a couple of pages of, her, people are calling it a manifesto, her journal leaked on the internet, where she described, sort of this hatred of little white boys and cisgender people and stuff.
Yeah, it's that sort of, like, woke thinking, I think, is pretty toxic, and I think that's part of why I want to introduce the ideas I have out there, because it can replace gender ideology in a lot of ways. Because gender ideology, it exists because it serves this subpopulation of people that have gender issues. It sort of, like, offers them an explanation of who they are and how they came to be that way, in a way that they find satisfying overall. But it's not true. So I think it's important to replace the untruth with true things. And so I just want people to understand that there's two distinct types of transgenderism, and, like, sort of how to spot them and how it works, so that when they have these feelings, they can stop being confused and ashamed about it and just be like, oh, I'm a sexual minority. Okay, fine.
Makes sense. So AGPs, then, would you say that AGPs don't go for medicalization, or do you think a lot of AGPs do? Or
they absolutely do. They're the ones that want it the most. Like, they're the ones pushing politically in the trans movement, that are pushing the most for the child transition, so to speak, because there's, when it comes to passing, what's most important is for male to females is to not have signs of masculinization. And so that's why they're so intent on having puberty blockers, because, then they think, oh, I would have been able to pass if I had done that. And something that weirds me out about the youth gender transition is it's not being studied. Like you said, it's not being studied long term. And I would really prefer that if they are going to be doing this experimental treatment, that it is all centrally tracked, so that every single person that enters it is tracked. And so we can find out the true desistance rate. We can find out the true outcomes, because right now our methods of collecting information are not sufficient to do that. And so it's just this political battle rather than a sort of scientific, investigation into what's true.
At this point, I'm sort of the mind that we just need to sort of, like, end medicalized transition across the board, and because we're touching too many people. Yeah, I'd say even for adults, because I don't know at this point, if it actually helps the adults that claim who are helped by it. That's my subjective opinion, but and also I think the controls that we had on it before were pretty good. In prior ages, you had to live as a woman for many years before you could even be considered for the surgery. And the age, it was like, they wouldn't even consider anybody under the age of 35. Those are good controls. But at the same time, like, I don't know if it actually is helping, or if it's just sort of continuing to feed into the mental health problem without actually identifying and treating the root cause. This is why I have a lot of trouble with psychology in general. There's a lot of, like, charlatanesque psychologists out there, just like there's a lot of charlatanesque medical doctors who are willing
The
to
root cause here is a sexual orientation, so it's like it's kind of hard to treat the actual cause itself because you can't change that.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure. You can tell. I mean, well, when I say root cause, I'm thinking something to do with trauma. I'm thinking address, any sort of childhood deficiencies that happened in the individual's lifetime. We all sort of like come up with particular accumulated experiences that we have to like reflect upon in order to become fully functional adults. And some of us have, really tough backstories, while some of us have great parents. And depending on what your particular set of cards were dealt, if you had a really rough upbringing, the first thing you're going to have to do is deal with that. And if your rough upbringing resulted in sort of like an alternative sexual practice, like you probably want to, especially in that case, go back at your childhood and see if there was anything there that you need to sort of elaborate or reframe, because oftentimes, or really all the time, coming up, kids normalize their experience. They sort of assume that my experience is normal, and it's not until you get older and you have some distance from childhood that you can sort of look back and say, my experience was actually not typical. It was not normal for my parent to like lock me in the basement, or it was not typical for me to be abused in this particular way. A lot of kids don't get that until they get out into the world and have a chance to reflect. Right now we have these kids, like Jazz Jennings is a great example, whose cluster B mom sort of just like put him through the trans mill so that she could make a buck off his back. And now we're watching, I haven't watched the show I Am Jazz, but yeah, it's
I haven't either. I think it'd be kind of depressing.
Oh God, there's like 8 or 9 seasons. There was a point where like it actually had to stop because Jazz's mental health was so negatively impacted by the whole attention and stuff as he was trying to go to college.
Right. And Jazz is of a homosexual ideology, as far as I can tell. So
I don't really know.
I mean, that's sort of at least with the people I talk to online, that's sort of the overall consensus, is that Jazz seems to be like not of autogynephilic ideology, but of the homosexual ideology. And I think that I am kind of wary about transitioning to homosexuals, because it seems like as adults, basically the homosexual and the auto-heterosexual population are of similar size. And yet when you look at the transgender population, like 3/4 or more are not homosexual, which indicates they're a different type. And so as far as I can tell, in aggregate, the trans community, it's the autosexuals that are choosing to transition more often, and the homosexuals don't do it as much. So as far as I can tell, it seems like transition is less of a beneficial treatment for the homosexual ones, just on average, which is why, because they're choosing to do it less.
Yeah. Unless they're, it also depends on context too, right? In an American context or in a Western context, it's one thing. In Iran, homosexual males have to transition if they want to stay in Iran. Like they don't have a choice.
Yeah. And there's research, and Lawrence did some good studies on this. She looked at the prevalence of homosexual and non-homosexual transsexualism across different countries, and found that based on the societal individualism, whether they were collectivist or individualist, there was widely different proportions between these two types of transsexuals. And it was in the Eastern collectivist countries that there was more of the homosexual transsexuals, because that's about blending into society. And in the Western individualistic countries, there was more of the non-homosexual ones, which means that they're probably autogynephilic. And so, yeah, in the US, where it's more about following your bliss and like living your truth authentically, so to speak, there's going to be more of the autosexual gender transition.
I hate that phrasing, but yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, though. I totally understand what you mean. Yeah. It's more individual, sort of self-centered. We're much more, have that ability for you to sort of break out and do what you want. Whereas
yes, freedom.
They kill you in other places for that. Right, exactly. Freedom. Woo. I think we've pretty much exhausted the topic of autoheterosexuality, unless there was any other points you wanted to make before we moved on to talking about the controversy with GenSpec.
Um, let's see. Um,
Oh, I
yeah,
wanted to ask you, do you have
Yeah.
any impressions on like the cluster B disorders and its association with transgender or AGPism?
I think sexual minorities in general have higher rates of mental health disorders. This goes for people that same-sex attracted. It goes for the autosexuals as well, as far as I can tell. So I think it's just that, like, if one thing goes off track in your development, it's more likely that other things will as well. And so that's just why, yeah, there's higher rates of mental disorders among sexual minorities and higher rates of suicidality among them. I tend to lean more essentialist rather than social constructionist, and so I think that I don't put too much stock in the minority stress theory stuff. I think it's mostly just due to developmental, genetic, sort of inborn factors that sexual minorities are having greater mental health issues, and it's not because of oppression per se.
Mm-hmm. Word. Yeah, I don't buy that at all. I mean, yes, I can understand how oppression would, lead to that, but United States, especially, Australia, UK, are some of the most liberal, progressive democracies in the world. Countries where you would just have the ability to go out in public, men dressed as women, without being attacked is an advance, in my opinion, from not, from where we were, or where countries are like, was it Uganda? This is very anti-homosexual, or the Muslim countries are very anti-homosexual. Now, my buddy Basil, he would come in and he would say that actually, like, they're the ones that are advanced and we're the ones that are backward because of the deleterious impacts of homosexual behavior on the wider, and here you can see his collectivist sort of background coming in, the wider sort of social, the society, and how it's, causes now leading to children sort of being caught up into it, which is like the major sort of concern that everybody's really having.
Yeah, and it's a reasonable concern. But I think, though, that generally the population that is same-sex attracted or auto-heterosexual, like these sort of sexual minorities, they'll comprise less than 10% of the population.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And so I think it's good that people are allowed to be gay without being treated poorly these days, and that people can wear whatever gender of clothing they want. But I do have some issues with how it's being taught in school, like about the queer theory, how they're trying to deconstruct normativity itself, because that's not going to work if you're trying to just dissolve a society. Like,
that's communism,
that.
Right? That's what they're doing there. It's not
right.
It's not even about the queer theory per se. With communists too, it's always never about what they're actually saying it's about. It's always about disrupting the sort of.
It's about the revolution.
Yeah, it's about revolution. It's like, how can we use whatever this is in order to piss people off enough that they're willing to engage in violence? And so that's why they focus on these like very sort of triggering aspects, or at least that's how I see it. And then eventually you do get people that will, kind of go, and they pop off violently because they believe a lot of the lies that are promulgated by these extremists in the gender sort of neo-Marxist movement.
Yeah, I have issues with wokeness too. I didn't talk about it too much in my book because I was just trying to describe real stuff, and that woke isn't real. But
did you mention like predators at all in your book, like predatory personality disorders, the psychopaths?
No.
Oh, word. Okay.
I'm just trying to explain basically what autoheterosexuality, like male autogynephilia, female autoandrophilia, and I also have chapters that explain the other types of autosexuality, just to really drive home the point that these orientations are real. If there's people, like the example I use in the book is like, if there's people that identify as dragons that also say that they're dragons in their sexual fantasies and that they're sexually attracted to dragons, like maybe, just maybe, this also happens with heterosexuality too, you know?
Sure.
Yeah, it's sort of like what people, the atheists might call an outsider test, where you sort of show an example outside of the people's, like, the category that get defensive about how, like, if you're trying to like explain to a Christian how God isn't real, you would sort of ask them about like whether they think Hindu stuff is real, and then be like, well, do you see how, like, maybe the Hindu reasoning isn't that good for stuff, like maybe yours also isn't as well. um so
Yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely a real phenomenon, right? We have it. It definitely happens. I know there's probably a lot of spurned women who are pissed off that their husbands turned out to be AGP.
right, and that's part of why I'm doing what I'm doing, because that's just another thing, another bad externality of the gender ideology, is that, like, there's something that's wrong about autogynephilia and autoandrophilia being covered up, is there's people that are getting into committed long-term relationships, and they're, let's say, use the example of autogynephilia, there's these wives whose husbands like come out as trans after they've already married or even had kids, and they withheld that from their wives the whole time. And this is wrong to the women. They have a very limited fertility window. It's like lying by omission. It's really wrong. And I think that
It's a bit of a bait and switch.
right. And the thing is, like, I'm not even like trying to assign blame to the autogynephilic men that do this, because they're not being told, like, the truth about their condition is being hid from them. So it's not like they even were capable of understanding where those feelings came from. And so I'm hoping that if more of them figure out that they're autogynephilic, that, like, I think they should tell anyone they're dating on the first or second date. So that if that other person is not okay with that they don't waste any of their time. And
yeah. Well, if there's a sexual behavior, I mean, gay people, gay men sort each other by tops and bottoms, like they won't even consider, a bottom won't even consider dating another bottom, or a top won't even consider dating another top, because the idea of not having regular penetrative anal sex is just so far beyond their frame of reference that they couldn't even consider it.
Right.
So,
but like with heterosexuality, it's like an even bigger deal, like I said, because women have a smaller fertility window, and then if there's kids involved, you're like breaking up a family. And I want to avoid that whole situation from happening in the first place, from creating the trans widows, so to speak.
And you think you could do that by properly educating people about heterosexuality and giving them sort of like the, hey, heads up, like, if this is you, maybe don't marry a straight lady without telling her first.
Or don't even go on like a third date before she knows.
Right. Yeah.
Basically, I want the men to know so that they can hopefully do the right thing and tell their partners. And I want the women to know so that even if their partner's not doing the right thing, they'll be able to spot it themselves and sort of like decide what they want to do about it.
So how do we do that? How do we, increase awareness of auto heterosexuality? Like, conversations like this obviously are one way to do it. Your book is another way.
It's important that when it's talked about, it's not talked about in a way that shames a person or makes them out to be bad. Mm-hmm. We can shame
similarly how we
actions,
homosexuality and bisexuality.
Right, exactly. Like it's sort of analogous to those in that it's not innately morally wrong to act on it. However, there are certain proper ways of acting on it and improper ways of acting on it. And once people understand the situation better, we'll figure out sort of the boundaries of proper etiquette. And I'm hoping that will improve people's matchmaking in terms of dating, and also just bring some reason to the whole gender debate, because right now it's a lot of feelings, but there isn't much science going down.
Yeah, so like that's kind of, it comes back to my point that we have this sort of like overarching problem in society where cluster B personalities like psychopaths, narcissists, borderline individuals sort of have this tendency to control and corral the conversation. They're the most hysterical, so they're clearly like generally the loudest in the room. So like Libs of TikTok, for example, their whole brand is basically taking these people and, relatively small accounts, and then sort of blowing them up in a different medium, like taking the things off of TikTok and putting them on Twitter, gives it a cross exposure to a different audience. But that's one of the things that I've seen or I've come across, is that a lot of people who claim the trans identity, or they're actually basically just like, a psychopath or a sociopath, or a really bad narcissist, or cluster B is sort of like the umbrella term for those people, and the disorders are not they're not really specific to each one. A psychopath has sort of all of the traits, whereas a borderline is more somebody it doesn't have a very stable sense of identity, whereas the psychopath and sociopath tend to be more conniving. But all of these individuals, I think, crop up in these movements, and it's a big problem because they're sort of driving the discourse and acting as examples of their class, whether it's an AGP or, homosexual or a trans woman or whatever. And it's giving this sort of impression to, the world, the audience, that, that is the typical version of, that type of person, when that's actually just an example of a cluster B personality, who is appropriating the identity of a class in order to accrue power and sympathy to themselves.
Right. And so I think that is partially an issue with social media, where whoever is the most outlandish and triggers the most reactions is going to, get the largest engagement. And this probably holds true even like outside of the whole gender and sexuality discussions, with wokeism more broadly. It's cluster B. The cluster B influence is real and obvious. And yeah, it's really interesting when I think about how we have there's the individualist approach to seeing these as psychological disorders. And then there's sort of in aggregate, the sort of like cultural egregore that forms around these disorders, where you'll have, say like all the trans people grouping together as a culture, like making a trans culture. You'll have all the cluster Bs creating this new, creating different norms of behavior that are, pretty outlandish and histrionic, and basically creating a societal version of their individual disorder.
Yeah. I mean, RuPaul, I blame for ruining homosexual culture by exposing it to the straight people. It was so much better when we kept drag in our little dark clubs. It was ours. It was, you had to go to a, nightclub in order to see it. And it was an experience. It was like you'd be there in person. And then RuPaul sort of just took drag, commercialized it, made it sort of family friendly, and then flopped it onto TV. And basically it was a money printer for decades, and still is. The show is incredibly popular. And that just sort of irritates me. So any opportunity I have to sort of trash talk RuPaul, I will take it.
Yeah, I could tell you got beef.
Yeah, I'm just like, why did you have to go and take all of our fun things and give them to the straight people? Bad. Very, very bad. So what happened at GenSpec? You want to get into that?
Yeah. So
maybe we should start. Let's back up a little bit. What is GenSpec?
Yeah, GenSpec is an organization that's, broadly speaking, trying to battle gender ideology and destroy WPATH, and it wants to make the non-medical approach to treating gender distress the norm. And so, yeah, it kind of has two sort of things. It has this, it cares about the people with gender distress, or talks about caring about them and wants to reduce that. And then it also deals with the gender issue on the societal level of wanting to, like I said, battle against gender ideology.
Right. And WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. So this is an organization that puts together the standards of care, that sort of would say, giving puberty blockers to kids at this age or cross-sex hormones at that age. That's sort of WPATH's shtick, really. And so GenSpec is an alternative to that. They want to be a place, a resource for families and parents who are suffering gender confusion, perhaps, but they want to focus on the non-medicalized intervention. Is that approximately?
Yeah, that's basically it. Like they just, and politically they come from, I think it's fair to say they come from a gender critical perspective, from a sort of gender critical feminist perspective overall.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so what was the culture though? So there was a conference. I know Laura went. I was not paying attention to this at all at the time it happened.
Well, there's no controversy at the conference itself. 2 days later on Twitter, yes, there was a controversy, but the conference itself was perfectly fine. When people left, they had no idea that there was going to be any Twitter bullshit. So there's a big separation here between what the conference was physically actually like in reality and the sort of like hyper real online like facsimile of it.
Yes, the internet is a hall of mirrors, and social media tends to not catch the important bits, right?
Right. And so basically the conference, it was fun because it was, I got to meet a bunch of the people, the big names in the whole gender scene.
Did you give a talk? You talk about HGPs? Okay.
No.
You just went to the conference as a attendee?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. I just attended. And I brought some books to give away. I didn't sell them. I just gave them away to, the people who are more influential because, if one of them reads, it has a much bigger impact.
Sure. Yeah. You're promoting your book.
Yeah. I just giving it away for free. And, it was fun. There's a bunch of talks both days. Is overall very politically slanted talks. It wasn't so much about like how do we help people with gender distress, and that was something I was disappointed in, and I thought it was going to be more about like how can we help people that are going through gender distress, and it was more about how can we defeat gender ideology and defeat WPATH. Okay. Yeah, so there was talks, and then around after business hours are over each day, there'd be basically everyone just hanging out either in the convention hall or in the hotel lobby area. Everyone's just talking and meeting each other,
right.
Kind of like a professional sort of conference. And yeah, and I didn't have any social issues with people there. I got along with people just fine. And I had a good time meeting people.
And then, so what happened? So you and Laura like took a picture together.
Yeah, I was talking with Laura the last day. We were just talking for a couple hours because I followed her online for a while. I like her like aesthetic and her like vibe. She's pretty based.
Love her vibe. She is based.
Yeah. She undeniably based vibes. And so I was like, hell yeah, I'm gonna talk to her. And yeah, so we were just talking, and then the person who ran the social media account for GenSpec was like, hey, do you guys want to take a picture? And we're like, all right. And we did that. And then, the social media person said, do you want me to mention your book in there? I'm like, yeah, sure. And then, I told her what the title is. She got it slightly wrong, but still, the title was in there. It was basically like, hey, look, these people are here and Phil has a book. That was the extent of the promotion, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then that was posted immediately. And it wasn't until a couple days later, I think Kelly J. Keene, Posey Parker, I think she retweeted it, and like in a really aggro way with a quote tweet. And it triggered, it sort of cascaded from there. And a bunch of gender critical feminists and rad femmes got really mad that there was a literal autogynephile there wearing a dress.
Yeah, that they did.
And the weird thing about this is that like I'm pretty well versed in their ideology. I get how it works. And they've said for years that it's okay for people to be gender nonconforming as long as they don't infringe on women's spaces or like ask to be called anything. Like they were pretty clear that that was okay to be gender nonconforming. But then apparently that was not the case as long as you have the thought crime of like admitting that you're autogynephilic. Whereas if you lie about it, apparently it's fine.
Oh, I see. They wouldn't have been complaining if you were like, wearing ladies' underwear underneath the thing, but because it was external, I think that was the problem, or because you were presenting as a woman.
It's like I don't even consider it presenting as a woman. I do wear women's clothes, yeah, but I'm pretty realistic about what I look like in terms of my height and facial features. And I know I don't look anything like a woman, so I mean, I just think of it as, yeah, I just wear women's clothes. I'm not even like trying to ask anyone to call me different names or anything. I'm literally just wearing different clothes, which I don't think imposes on anyone else. But the feminists were acting as if I was like coercing them to be involved with it just by the fact that they might see me.
Yeah, I think the language I heard somebody use was that, how did they put it? That you were sort of like mandatorily forcing them to participate in your sexual behavior. That was the accusation. And then it got into conversations about whether or not you were aroused by wearing women's clothes.
There was a lot of speculations about how
aroused in the moment.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that discourse you saw, but it was pretty unhinged at times. People like acting as if I was just like had like a perma boner or something. And it's like, no, I was actually just there paying attention to talks and meeting people. But and yeah, I did write a book about sexual orientation, but like, I'm not nearly as horny as they think I am, or that they're imagining I am. I was pretty much there on business, doing business stuff, meeting people. And
so you weren't wearing chastity underneath your dress and secretly...
No, not caged nor plugged. Nope. And
just, you won't elaborate. The straight people don't need to know.
No, let's not elaborate on that.
Nope.
Yeah, I was just wearing clothes that are pretty typical for me. I live in Portland where it's okay to dress weird. And I was just wearing my normal everyday clothes. They're not at all scintillating to me. I just put them on in the morning and then I do whatever stuff I'm going to do. Just like I imagine most people handle their clothing situation. And yeah, they got really mad. Well, the feminists online did. The people that were actually there in person weren't mad. Like it's important to be clear. This is entirely an online thing that happened because of how Twitter and social media works. In person,
there was,
it was fine.
Even a debate that happened between I think it was Kelly J. Keene and Stella O'Malley, I want to say. I think what her name was.
Yeah, they had a conversation.
I didn't hear it. I didn't get around to it. I just saw that it happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that one. I've seen a lot of discourse.
Sorry, go ahead.
I've seen a lot of discourse related to this. And it's just really interesting to see that it sort of created infighting among the feminists because I was following the gender critical rules of using the men's bathroom and literally not doing anything besides having gender nonconforming clothing, which is something they've stipulated as allowed for years. But on the other hand, they sort of propagandize themselves to think that AGPs are the literal worst people ever. And so they hate autogynephiles. And so there's this conflict between their ideology and sort of their disgust and hatred response to the fact that there's an autogynephile there.
Yeah. Well, you could say, I mean, feminists definitely. So feminists certainly have it out for men in general. I know and I've spoken with many men who have been the recipient of what I would call female supremacy.
Yeah.
And or gynocracy is another word that I've heard thrown around, which I think is hilarious. But I can only imagine how a man who presents as woman as a part of, you know, his daily life could additionally trigger them, because now how dare you, man, don their appearance, you know, thinking you are equivalent to them. How dare you, sir? How dare you?
Well, I mean, and the thing that's ridiculous about it to me is like, I wish I could convincingly don the like a woman-like appearance. Like they're getting mad about something that like I would like to be real, but it's not real.
So I think the complicating factor here is we have a lot of women who have been, you know, emotionally harmed by, you know, men who came up and ended up gender bending, and you know they felt that betrayal, that sting, which sucks. You know, yes, terrible. Like those dudes were shitty for going through that process, and putting those women through that. But you know, that's how sort of those men had to deal with, or you know, I guess they didn't have to deal like with that way, but that's sort of the sort of the impact, really, we could say, of the societal negativity towards, you know, men playing with their gender expression, or presenting as women. You know, they have it in the closet, so to speak.
There's something about this that's confusing to me, is where like they're getting mad at me, whereas the work I'm doing would help reduce that situation of the trans widow situation. Like that thing that they're getting mad about, the thing I'm doing will help reduce that happening in the future. And so there's sort of some there's some end goals that are convergent between me and them. Like obviously I don't agree with feminists on all of their beliefs, but like there are some end goals in common, and I fail to see how what I was doing is anyway threatening to their political project. You'd think they would be glad to have me there.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's a very emotional issue for a lot of them, and women are also more collectivist than men. So when one of them is harmed, sort of all of them are harmed. And there's a little bit more of that tribal sentiment, especially in an extra insular, you know, movement or community like the gender critical space, where you're going to have a lot of people who have already sort of dealt with betrayal and rejection from the wider, you know, umbrella. They're going to feel a little bit more protective of that space. So I could see where they get a little vicious if they perceive a threat. A lot of the rhetoric I heard too in one of the spaces was they were concerned about, you know, you and your book being around quote unquote vulnerable individuals. So I guess these are families and you know, adults who are suffering from like gender confusion. So I'm not sure what exactly they were.
But my book explains the psychology of the most common type of gender confusion. So it's like it's kind of incredibly appropriate that I'm there, and it would be an omission to not have someone like me there that knows about the psychology of the most common type of gender issues.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think it's a perfectly reasonable argument.
Right. I think it's the sort of conflict I was mentioning between like GenSpec's desire to defeat gender ideology politically and its desire to help gender distressed individuals themselves. You know, because like the stuff I'm doing is more about helping the gender distressed individuals themselves. And I think it will have some secondary effects that help defeat gender ideology, but that's not why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Word. Yeah, no. So one thing I was going through when I saw your book, a lot of labels, that was like my major issue with like the terminology is one of the things that we see happening. Like all these terms are being thrown out there. And while I think labels can be helpful, they can also be misleading. So we can have a lot of predators using these concepts as camouflage in order to conceal some of their more lurid, you know, interests and things. So that would be the main thing that I would be concerned about.
That I'm introducing vocabulary?
No, that predators could take the concepts and run with them. So not that the concepts themselves have a problem, but that we'll see sort of just like they've donned the trans woman identity, you know, or what can they use? How can they use the concept of AGP in order to acquire, you know, more like access to women's spaces or something like that? That's probably where they're concerned.
Right, but I don't think that's a realistic concern because compared to the ideology that says that anyone that feels like they're a woman and says they're one literally is one, I think the autogynephilic explanation is not as compelling, in terms of inclusion. So again, like I just think that people knowing more, like having more accurate beliefs, using constructs that are actually real and map onto reality will sort of bring some sanity to the situation.
We could definitely use some more sanity in this situation. Yeah, so I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with Gen Spec and whether or not they can displace or replace WPATH as sort of the main organization or body that sort of guides these individuals. Um, Frankly, I don't even know if we need an organization that does that, per se. I guess we do because we have these individuals, and
Yeah, no,
there's always going to be a need for that. So
there will be. It recurs across generations because it's like for people that have the genuine sort of distress that leads to gender transition and then they benefit from it. Like I said, that they're generally either homosexual or autoheterosexual, and so these predispositions, they recur across generations and across cultures. So we do need to figure out what the right way, what the optimal way of dealing with it is. And I think by actually using the correct constructs, that we'll be able to more accurately figure out the best way of dealing with it.
totally. Yeah, so I guess people are probably concerned about like the expansion of the idea. So we have like this sort of like creep of concept from, the acceptance of homosexuals to a radical gender ideology. We've gone too far now, so we need to sort of like go back towards the center of like normality. I think AGP, the concept of it can help bring a little bit more like rationality to the discussion as opposed to just this idea, the radical gender idea of, oh, actually that boy is really a girl, which doesn't make any fucking sense whatsoever.
Right. The question is more like, will that boy benefit from living as a girl? Like that's the sort of tangible question is like, is gender transition appropriate for this individual rather than like, are they metaphysically actually a girl?
Right. So you would argue in certain cases that answer is yes, whereas I would say across the board, no. Right?
I would, yeah, no, it definitely is the right choice for some individuals. Um, and yeah, and especially when it comes to adults, like, I can't see, like, I have an issue right now with the fact that the causes of transsexualism are being covered up. So it makes it so that even adults don't even have good information on why they want to transition. But if that gets fixed, and I don't see a good reason why adults shouldn't be able to pursue that.
You can make an argument that it's like a tattoo, but then again, you could also make an argument that we don't let people remove fingers or, well, I guess we do, don't we? Well, actually, I don't know if we do that or not. But it's definitely not medicine at that point. It's definitely more like body modification, which
there's some people that get there's some people that they call transabled that have the body integrity dysphoria.
Do they do that surgery in the United States? Do they allow that? Do you know?
My understanding is it's pretty hard to get, and usually the people that have it have to sort of force the hospitals to do it by severely injuring themselves in a way where, like, when they end up at the hospital, they have to get amputated.
Ugh. Okay.
So there are some cases where it has been done, in a planned manner with a lot of like vetting ahead of time with psychologists and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty rare overall. But yeah, I think some adults do benefit from transition, and I think transsexuals should be allowed to be transsexuals, and it would be good if there was some more gatekeeping on it and some better education on like, hey, here's why you feel this way, because there are serious issues with how the current system is set up.
What do you think? 18 is the cutoff for medicalized transition, or 25, or what do you think? 16?
I think, I mean, with adults, it's different between the sexes, where like the females, it's not as crucial that they get hormones earlier because it's easier
Females
to
can always
pass.
masculinize later, right?
Right. It's sort of like about
Like
masculinization is
Angel
such a
looks like a
one-way
dude.
trip. Yeah. So it's like it's the earlier interventions, at least in terms of like physical appearance outcomes, are more crucial for the males. And I think like if there is a subset of minors that would be candidates for transition, it would be some of the autogynephiles. I don't think the homosexuals are as good of a fit, just because, like I said, it seems like they're not choosing the transition as much, relative to their proportion of the population, and transition doesn't literally give them directly what they want. Whereas the auto heterosexuals, like everything that transition gives them physically and socially, like they want all of it directly. So transition just seems like a better intervention for the autosexuals compared to the homosexuals.
Have you had any medicalized transition? Do you mind if I ask?
I haven't yet, just because.
No hormones, no nothing.
I mean, I dabbled for like a month or so, but I lost strength really quickly, and I was like, this is not going to be worth it.
Right.
Just because I am very tall and masculine, and basically the benefits I'll get from estrogen are going to be so marginal compared to whatever the trade-offs are. And so I'm sort of approaching it in a rational way. Whereas if I had a different physique, such that like passing was a possibility, I would probably be on estrogen and doing that. But I'm just being realistic about it. And actually there's a lot of autogynephiles that sort of are realistic about this, that don't transition because they're realistic about how they actually look.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. No, I was just curious because I could never do anything. I could never transition. Like I'm happy as a man. I don't have like gender feelings. Like the idea of a gender feeling to me is completely foreign. No, I am a man. I'm okay with being a man. I mean, I guess I was weird with the concept as a boy, but that's because I didn't really understand manhood. I was immature.
Right. And like I said, there's sort of a developmental phase that homosexuals go through where they might have some gender discomfort in youth, but then they tend to get over it around puberty.
Yeah, one thing I do recall as a young boy, I was very uncomfortable around older men as a young lad. I was little, just like I just felt uncomfortable around them. They made me nervous.
You mean like in a heart fluttery way?
I don't remember specifically. I just remember being uncomfortable around older men as a young lad. I think it was just because I was surrounded by women primarily. I had female teachers. I was around my mom's friends. In that 0 to 5 window. I personally think it's really important that like little kids, most of the time, especially in a Western context, women handle the rearing of the children, especially in that early window, 0 to 5. It's only become more in the last probably like 10, 15 years, where including the male parent in a lot of the baby aspects has become more in vogue and more popular. But I think that, I like my case, like I said, I wasn't around a lot of older guys. I wasn't around a lot of men. My dad worked a lot of hours, especially, when I was young. I was the first child, so it was early in the relationship and they were trying to build their wealth. So he was just at work frequently. So I think that sort of contributed to my discomfort around older adults. And I think that led to a mystique around men. And I think that sort of led to an attraction that ultimately made me a big old faggot.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect you would have ended up gay even if you had a different upbringing, but
it's
no
possible.
way to tell for sure.
It's very possible. I feel like there could have been, because I say I'm gay. There's probably like once out of every like 10,000 women I find attractive. It's very, very rare.
Are they masculine women?
They're definitely they're more like I would say they're confident, not masculine like presenting, but more, they definitely have like a stronger vibe about them.
You mean like big dick energy?
Yeah, they stand out. They
Yeah.
command attention. That's one of the things that I've seen very few times. Very few. But I think we're rounding it around 90 minutes. Is there any final thoughts you wanna throw in there? We should again promote what's your book was auto heterosexual. I keep messing up.
Yeah, it's just the word heterosexual with auto in front, but it's auto heterosexual, attracted to being the other sex. It explains the most common type of transgenderism, and I'm also on Substack at phililly.substack.com, where I've put a lot of the chapters on there for free too, just because I wrote the book so that people would read it, and I also have a Twitter at autogynephilic.
Here's your Substack.
Yeah, and basically I'm doing all this because I think it's messed up that people that are autogynephilic and autoandrophilic struggle with gender issues for years on end, and no one just straight up tells them like, hey, here's what's actually happening to you, and it's okay to be this thing, but like, hey, this is what's actually happening. And just because they're being bullshitted by gender ideology.
Totally.
And it's
the infamous
and also all the externalities of gender ideology in terms of, say, like the rapid onset stuff with some of the females, is the sports thing, the prison thing. Like, there's just so many ways that ideology is suboptimal and not serving the people that have gender issues themselves, let alone the broader population. And I just want to replace the gender woo with gender science.
Fair. Very fair. Thanks for taking the time, Phil. Appreciate it. Perhaps we'll have you back on in the future. We can have we do like these regular like little group live streams. I may tag you or invite you in the future for those.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. Don't forget, everybody, like, comment, subscribe, share the show with your friends. I'll be back again soon with another one. Thank you. Stay safe, stay sane. Bye-bye.